Jane, tell me about maladaptive daydreaming.
Well, that started as early as I could remember. I think from really young childhood, I would play school like all kids do. But if I didn't have any friends over, I'd play it in my head and I would be the teacher. And I would imagine like all the kids in the class had different powers, some could fly. And I could play this for hours. And I would twirl around in circles and kind of do this with my hands. And grown-ups would ask what I was doing and I'd be like, oh, I'm just playing school in my head. And then around 7 or 8, I started changing it from school to be episodes of my favorite TV show. So I would like watch the Brady Bunch in my head, but it would be different episodes. I would change it. Sometimes I would be an actress in the show. Sometimes I'd be another character on the show. Sometimes I wouldn't be in it at all, but I would just change the plots and write new ones because after all, watching the Brady Bunch on TV, just the same reruns over and over again, so I wanted to watch new ones. And I did that with like all the shows of my childhood, Little House on the Prairie, Brady Bunch, 8 is Enough, Facts of Life. And often, sometimes I would, again, pace around in circles. Didn't really think it was a problem because I was only doing it when I was bored and didn't have a friend to play with and there was nothing else to do. But a big shift happened around junior high school because that's when I learned how to do it without spinning in circles and I could actually daydream just sitting still. So I started doing it in school. Around 7th grade, I started watching General Hospital. It's the age of Luke and Laura. And I would be sitting in pre-algebra class and I'd be watching General Hospital in my head. And then it became a little more of a problem because unlike before when I had to spin in circles and I only did it in select period, I started doing it over and over and over and I felt like it was becoming compulsive. By high school, I was still a very good student because I could force myself to study, but in class, I had no idea what was going on. But the night before the test, I would teach myself the textbook. But I just started to feel like I'd go out with friends and I'd be half listening to my friends and half creating stories in my head. And I started feeling like I preferred my daydreams to real life. So I had kept them a secret for a while. And in high school, I told my parents and tried to get help, but everybody just laughed at me and said everybody daydreams. My parents did take me to a few mental health professionals. No one really thought that there was anything wrong with it. They told me to just keep daydreaming, so I did. And I did it all the way through law school. And again, I can't really say it hurt my life, but I was just exhausted because I was trying to keep up with the real world and try to keep up with all the characters in my head. And I never ever thought, I knew they were daydreams. I knew they were just not reality. I never confused reality and fiction, but I just felt it became exhausting. And again, I kept trying my whole life, trying to find someone who daydreamed like me, and no one knew what I was talking about. Like, everybody kept telling me everybody daydreams, but when I talked to them about like the detail and the hours and the plots, doctors just looked at me like I've never heard of such a thing. So finally, after I graduated law school, I found a doctor who was like, I've never heard of this, but if it's bothering you, there's a lot of OCD in your family. So he put me on an SSRI. Examples of SSRIs are Paxil, Prozac. But he put me on fluvoxamine, which is one that's used more typically with people with OCD. And it was like magic. Within 6 weeks, all my characters disappeared. And I eventually weaned down on the dose so that I still was able to daydream, but the difference was I was in control of it. And I could give a really good example. I used to hate it. I live in New York City and I walked to the subways and I would always daydream. And I used to hate it when someone would try to walk with me. But once I was on the Luvox, I remember waiting around for a colleague to go with me because I wanted the company. So I started to appreciate the company of real people. And then I kind of forgot about daydreaming. That was around age 29 or so. And I just was not a problem in my life anymore. And then a friend called me up and told me that her daughter was spinning in circles, and she's someone who used to babysit me when I was little. And she was like, Jane, I think that my daughter's doing exactly what you're doing. So all of a sudden, I went on the internet because there was no internet when I was going through this. And let me tell you, I spent like years going through psychology databases, my parents' library, trying to find something on this daydreaming topic. And there was nothing. But now that there was the internet, I started to do research for my friend's daughter. and I found this kind of obscure article. It was on an Indian parenting website about a little girl who daydreamed too much, didn't pay attention in class. The article itself didn't seem very relevant, but when I saw the comments, my jaw dropped. It was like post after post of people exactly like me. Many of them spun in circles, all loved their daydream worlds, but they felt like they were compulsive and addictive. It was amazing. So I convinced my psychiatrist to write me up as a case study. And that time I was really embarrassed about this whole thing. So I was anonymous. I was patient X. And then though, the person who, my psychiatrist actually convinced his friend, a researcher, to write it up. And she got all of this feedback from people reaching out to her, and she would forward them to me. And later, that's when I decided to go back to school to study psychology. And the co-researcher, the person who wrote my case study, had been hearing from hundreds of people from around the world. And we started to do research on the topic. And eventually I ended up working on 3 peer-reviewed empirical articles, and it's now called Maladaptive Daydreaming Disorder. So I'm really proud of the fact today that if a college student were to look at a database like I did in college, I came up empty-handed, but they're now gonna come up with the articles that I helped write and my case study, and there's a whole line of literature on there about maladaptive daydreaming. And then I did go public with my story in an article in The Atlantic about my maladaptive daydreaming experiences, and I continue to hear from people from all over the world who are either worried about themselves in the daydreaming or they're worried about their children in the daydreaming. And I try the best I can to get back to every one of them.